And you know, it seems to me everyone's for scientifically informed decisions, unless the science conflicts with what they think their own economic interests are, right? So I'm most familiar with the challenge that Steve's working on, when you have fishermen who are, you know, want the situation to remain as it is without changes, and obviously in that big delta, it's all about change, it's about dramatic change. You have navigation interests who think that that river mouth that you saw just disappearing almost before your eyes is sustainable by continued dredging every year, and will reject any science that would suggest otherwise. So how do we, as scientists, you folks are in the practice, what advice can you give us as scientists to help communicate more effectively when our science is met by opposition because people think it's not in their interest?
Visualization of things that have happened before at similar locations under similar circumstances, and aligning people to understand that if things are not intervened, or things are not reduced in terms of the scope and the rate of change, that through visualization, communication, that those things will happen to their specific area of interest.
Mm-hmm. Others want to?
I guess I think, and I know scientists have heard this before, but it's a lot about how you communicate the information. People need to hear it over and over. But I also think in our project, we've thought a lot about the 20% that hears you, the 20% that won't hear you, and the 60% in the middle that you need to bring along and help understand. And to give yourself permission sometimes, I know this isn't politically correct, and I'm in Washington, D.C., but to give yourself permission to sometimes not focus on the people you can't bring around, and you guys are familiar with this process, I'm sure, but to focus on the people in the middle who really do crave and want the information, and try and bring them along.
Steve?
Yeah, I think I'd put it this way. There are two pieces, I think, to this. One is that it's important to be right. That's what the science is about. And it's not enough to be right. But because it's not enough doesn't mean that it's not still important. And so an essential element is to continue to focus on getting the science right, and don't get depressed or change jobs or quit trying because there are some idiots in the Congress, or because even members of your own family can't quite
Your own family, yeah.
understand, right? I mean, we all go to Thanksgiving, and I used to be on television occasionally, and whenever I would be on Fox News, all my family would know. And when I wasn't on Fox, nobody knew about it, and that's the nature. So you can imagine the discussions around the Thanksgiving table about climate change and that result. But the key really is to continue to do it, and out fisheries issues down along the coast. We had largely a brackish to freshwater fishery on either side of the river, if you go back historically and see what was caught, anything like that. But with the loss of the coast, with the loss of the marshes, as the saltwater comes in, the nature of the fisheries have changed. Well, now the nature of the economics has changed as well. And so people who take people out, and charter fishermen who take people out to catch speckled trout or redfish or saltwater species, they don't like the idea of putting freshwater back into those marshes. It's pretty straightforward analysis for them. But if I can use the technical term, they make shit up about the science. They make it up. And if that vacuum is there, I come out of, as Don said, I have a political background. There is an immutable rule of politics. It's true about physics as well, but vacuums get filled. They get filled. And if there's not good science about what's going on in the fisheries or what's going on in the river, people make stuff up. And they will fill in, and that'll be the debate. So instead of there being good solid data, good monitoring, good ability to actually test what the real truth is, then you get caught up in these silly conversations. That's what's so complicated about climate, is because climate is huge, and somebody can cherry pick little pieces of information and make stuff up, and we deal with that all the time. You guys have to keep filling that gap. If you do that, it makes it so much better for us to be able to actually have a conversation that we sometimes can't have. So.
Good answer.
Okay, let me throw it open for questions, comments from the audience. We've got 2 microphones around. Raise your hand and someone will find you out. Over there.
Will Knuckles, question for Dave. So you were talking about border reauthorization, which is limping along at an unbelievably slow pace. But one of the things that I guess it has to address, which is a reality coming in the world, is the post-Banamex shipping world, which is something I'm often thinking about and shocked that not many more people are, because that has a deadline. At some time they'll finish the schedule that's running behind, and the canal will be open and ships will be there, which has a rippling effect on all sorts of things, shipping, transportation, which relates to rails and roads and possibly energy exports. There's all sorts of effects that relate to that. So that's one of the things that we're actually going to have to address in some way through some mechanism, including WRDA and other things. So there's the concept of climate-ready infrastructure that people often talk about. I was wondering at the committee level where you're at, those sort of concepts often come with extra costs. Are you getting information that's useful to you from the engineering and science community about those trade-offs, or is the budget constraints that you were talking about making that analysis really irrelevant?
First, prefacing my response by saying that, I handle the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Subcommittee, not the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee, and I have not been directly involved with the WRDA bill or the conference. It is an example of how the Congress is challenged to be able to address even imminent needs for infrastructure and address it in a way that is prospective and not entirely reactive. Part of the challenge is that, particularly when it comes to port infrastructure, not all of that infrastructure is funded by the federal government, or for that matter, government in general, but some of that, or a large percentage of it, is actually controlled, maintained, operated by the private sector. And it's more of a challenge that we have in terms of our approach to not try and dictate from top down infrastructure investments, at least over the past 15, 20 years, unlike our Canadian counterparts who decided, hey, we want a national freight policy, complete with infrastructure investments, and they've just gone about and done it, and now they're building it out. We have a much more cumbersome process that tries to bring along and develop a consensus on how best to support those private sector investments, which really are the ones who run the business, if you will, of moving things in and out of ports. So when you kind of double down on the complexity by adding something like climate change and coastal resilience, that just multiplies the difficulty in trying to develop a consensus on where to build, what to build, and how to build it.
And Dave, isn't it even worse than that? Because in this issue of ports, we not only don't have a national port policy, but we almost encourage fierce competition among the ports.
I agree. And in fact, the current scrum that's going on among ports in the southeastern United States to try and find those scarce dollars for channel deepening and harbor deepening, takes Jonathan Rush's demosclerosis, thesis, to task. Here it is. There's only going to be so much money, but instead of coming up with a thoughtful, forward-thinking policy as to, where really should we put that money, recognizing that there are going to be winners and losers, we avoid that, and we end up with a less than efficient process in the allocation of resources.
More questions, comments? Anyone? Oh, back over here, right?
I guess the question is twofold. First, why isn't the harbor maintenance fund used for harbor maintenance, and what can we do to change that?
Again, if I knew what was behind the wisdom of the Office of Management and Budget. Yeah, I would have won Powerball many years ago and would not be here, but would be, with my feet up, on a beach somewhere. Obviously the Congress authorized the taxes or the fees to provide for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Clearly there are lots of members in both the House and Senate who would like to see those funds fully spent for their authorized purposes. But this gets back to a point I made about the separation of powers. And even within the Congress, you have authorizing committees and you have appropriations committees. And generally speaking, the appropriators are the 800-pound gorillas in the room and dictate actually how money's spent. And within the zero-sum budget game that we are in now, a reality that is likely to be with us for years, obligating money that could otherwise be used to spend down other parts of the deficit or mask the budget debt, that is part of the kabuki theater of federal budgeting.
I would actually, so you came here for legal advice too, right? I would actually recommend actually challenging the misuse of those funds through the court system, because the Congress, he's right. I mean, every port authority, every navigation interest has been up here walking around, knocking on doors, trying to get that money released. The truth is, if they're all successful, there's only going to be a little bit of money for each of them anyway. But so it's not actually going to work out the way everybody would like it to. But nonetheless, because it's used to balance the budget, the money's not going to appear unless somebody forces it to happen. I hate that's the case, but I think that's the strategy that.
Maybe they could just change the name of the fund.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think
Deficit Reduction Fund of 19, whatever.
And what the effort that Steve's involved in, I mean, you almost can't, you can't have a conversation with the navigation interest unless they get beyond that, because that's the only thing you want to talk about. And it's big hard to them to think of what do you do in the bigger, longer term. More points? Yes.
Terry Quinn, University of Texas. I guess we've heard a lot about public investment, and my crystal ball is as fuzzy as anybody else's, but my guess is public investment is going to be meager in the out years. So what about private investment? How can we create an economic incentive to make private industry get involved in some of the tasks that we've been talking about all throughout the day?
Well, if y'all don't mind, we are the state master plan in Louisiana estimates over about 50 years about a $50 billion rough price tag for the restoration work that needs to be. As we look more closely at that, as we actually get into implementation, it's probably double that. It's more resources than we could ever imagine being available, even in a happy time for public investment, which we're clearly not in now. So we've been looking very hard at how do we create, looking at the range of issues from ecosystem services and actually pricing those services to investment strategies around benefits that come to industries which need the support of the infrastructure and land. For example, obviously the navigation industry, we need them, fundamentally need them. They also need that river and that port to be working well. So there's a conversation going there about how do we bridge the gap that exists between private and public financing, because nobody wins if we can't answer that question. The oil and gas industry, which is fundamental to the operation of the country's economy, so much of that comes through the pipelines and infrastructure and refineries that are centered around the Gulf Coast, particularly in Louisiana and Texas. In the Delta section, all of that infrastructure was built with two things at the time. One is the land was solid underneath the pipelines. It's not anymore. And two, those refineries, which had buffer coastlines, which had wetlands extending 100 to 150 miles out, are now faced with storm and storm surges that are directly upon them. And so they have a direct economic interest, as does the country, in that restoration work. So how do we make that work together with private and public sector funding in a process? In some cases, the oil industry has actually been involved in supporting financially and supporting local projects and things. It's a very dicey set of discussions when you start talking about more than that. But you can see the outlines of the possibility of private-public when everybody actually puts their interest on the table about how we might be able to go forward. And it's absolutely essential that we do that, because I think you're precisely right that the era that Dave laments as he describes what the Constitution intended. We really are out of that for any foreseeable future. And some of these issues, like the one I'm working on, if we aren't successful in the next 20 years, we'll save everybody a lot of money, because we're not going to be there, seriously. So that's part of it. Anyway, sorry for the long answer, but that's a really important question, I think.
Could supplement that locally from the Pac Northwest perspective. It wasn't private sector, but it was the state of Oregon that stepped in when the federal government could not prioritize dredging of low-use ports along the state of Oregon. So the state itself has funded the Portland district. We ran this through Office of Council. It was acceptable for us to dredge the low-use ports using state funds. So there's partnerships that might start aligning. But it's going to take some, the interim period will probably be somewhat painful, because things will not happen. And then the need, where capability exists, the need will figure something else out.
Yeah, one of the things that both of you folks know about this as well is that one of the challenges that you have is that there are some rules that prevent or limit the degree to which you could use common sense science to manage, to use these resources that we thought were waste, like dredge material, sediment, for more benefits. You use one. You showed one off of the Columbia River, but the rules require that you have to take the lowest cost disposal option. And someone else has to pay the difference. And so this is a big issue being debated in Louisiana with the volume of material you're talking about. Well, why are we still taking this material, which we now view as essential and vital, and throwing it away, basically? How can we find a way? It's maybe more approachable than big new infrastructure of using things in a more sensible way.
I'll just add one other thing. There's a relationship here that's going to be interesting as it plays out. One of the things that you can do as you build marsh is actually sequester carbon, so you get a double bang for the buck. Without any serious regulatory framework around the country, you don't have much of a price for carbon. But California has a actual regulatory response in place now. There are offsets that are available. It's not a huge market, but it's a market nonetheless. You're beginning to see creeping into this discussion an actual pricing system for carbon. And so where you can do sequestration through reforestation, when you can do it through managing forests better, when you can do it through wetlands construction, there are protocols now being developed to allow those things to be credited in these offset system, which begins to put a price on it. So that's another overlap there. That's not going to save everything, but it's another piece as you begin to layer these things together. As we all know, there's no silver bullet on these things. As you begin to layer them together, you begin to see that there may be some opportunities that merge private-public in ways that actually we haven't done before. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, this is something that's come up in the Transportation Committee. In fact, earlier this year, Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal established a special subpanel to look specifically into public-private partnerships, mostly to try and gain some additional insights into other alternative non-federal funding streams that might be available, but also to get at that Achilles heel, which is how to maintain infrastructure over time and how best to not only finance that, but dole out that responsibility. And Congressman Jimmy Duncan from Tennessee is the chair of that special panel, and they'll probably be wrapping up their work in July and issuing a report then. And hopefully that will help inform the debate on the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act.
So the other thing thought that I have is that since many of us come at this from sort of an oceanographic standpoint, They're major issues with respect to ocean science beyond just the land issues as well. So for example, if Steve's effort to select a changing course of the river, think of what happens to circulation in the Northern Gulf without that promontory out there. Think of what happens in terms of where you distribute the fresh water and how that influences the dynamics of the. Think of the wave energy issue with respect to understanding the oceanography of that system and how it affects the best choices and the implications of that. Thinking about how waves and currents affect the sediment distribution of the Oregon coast. So there's a lot of these practical issues that require, I think, innovative ocean science as well, brought to the table as well.